The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss. Over the past few years, I've walked my viewers through some of the greatest orchestral works of the early 20th century, focusing on the colors, architecture, and ingenuity of this explosive artistic period. But now let's jump back about 70 or 80 years to 1827, the evening of September 11th in Paris. On that night, a 24-year-old conservatoire student attended a performance of Hamlet by Charles Kemble's touring company. Compared to the more disciplined, note-perfect Shakespearean performances that we usually see today, Kemble's company delivered exaggerated, melodramatic readings. The early Romantic era French loved it, especially the near-hysterical delivery of Irish actress Harriet Smithson as Ophelia. The effect that she had on the young student went much further, though. His obsessive adoration for Smithson that was ignited on that evening went on to change the whole world of concert music for all time. As I'm sure most of you realize, that conservatoire student was Hector Berlioz, and the work that he composed was the groundbreaking Symphonie Fantastique. Before him, Beethoven, Schubert, and Weber had wrenched open the doorway to the Romantic era. Now Berlioz blasted the entire doorframe right off its hinges, and in doing so laid down the modern principles of orchestration that still define what we do today. Of course, the whole story of Symphonie Fantastique's artistic development and programmatic context is hugely fascinating, and I'd normally cover that in great detail in an intro video like this one. But this time I don't have to, as conductor Michael Tilson Thomas has already done that in the San Francisco Symphony's Keeping Score series. Last year, this video was made public on YouTube, and I strongly recommend watching it as an important supplement to these lectures.
The story was, in fact, a psychological self-portrait of its composer, blown up to a size suitable for an inspired egomaniac. He wrote the symphony in a state of acute emotional distress, but its raw materials had been a part of him for over 20 years, since the days of his childhood in the village of La Côte-Saint-André.
Tilson Thomas focuses on Berlioz's prolific imagination alongside his obsessive personality, but doesn't address his fastidious sense of organization and incredible craft. That contradiction at the heart of Berlioz's character is the most intriguing aspect of all, and the artistic discipline that structures his Symphonie Fantastique is no less compelling than the powerful emotionalism that drives it. To be honest, whole oceans of ink have already been spilled over the history and meaning of the Symphonie Fantastique, a lot of it by Berlioz himself, so there's no need for me to go over it again. What I feel I can best add here is some perspective on the instrumentation he used and what strides he made in orchestration. That's what we're both here for. But even in doing just that, there's no escaping at least a little bit of discussion around context. The Symphonie Fantastique is a programmatic work, telling the story of a young artist who's obsessed with an unattainable object of desire. A woman, to quote Berlioz, who unites all the charms of the ideal person his imagination was dreaming of. Each movement depicts a different fantastical reaction to this fixation. The first movement in the discovery of his ideal woman and the emotional turmoil into which he's plunged. The second movement imagines him seeing his ideal woman at a stately, elegant ball, the hypnotic rhythms of which haunt the artist wherever he goes after that. The third movement finds our artist in the countryside, listening to the conversational piping of shepherds out in the fields as he broods on his own isolation, with his hopes and anxieties reflected in the pastoral landscape. From there, the symphony takes on a decidedly darker tone, as the artist's mind wanders through disturbing fantasies after overdosing on opium. With the fourth movement's march to the gallows, convicted of the crime of murdering his beloved. And then the scorching finale, a witch's Sabbath gathering at his funeral, with his ideal woman returning like a demon to mock him over his grave. Unlike Mussorgsky's Night on the Bald Mountain, there's no pious ending with church bells chasing away the damned. Berlioz's Black Sabbath cheerfully plays its abominations through to the very last note. That alone would have made Symphonie Fantastique a shocking work to a lot of listeners of its day. Running like a thread through the entire symphony is the Irae fix. This is a quite extensive motive that represents Harriet Smithson, serving as the main thematic material for the first movement, then reappearing in various stylistic and melodic transformations in each of the following movements. Whenever you hear it, Berlioz is telling us that Harriet is somewhere in his musical storytelling, whether as a character or as a persistent memory. For all of Berlioz's expansions and subversions of the idea of symphonic form, there's still a certain standard plan to the movements. Reveries and Passions is essentially a sonata allegro just like any other symphonic first movement up to that time, with exposition, development, motion to the dominant key, recapitulation, and so on. Un Bal's waltz movement is a kind of scherzo both in rhythm and general form. The pastoral third movement fills the slot of the adagio, with a little bit of a callback to Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, while the ironic fourth movement's march to the scaffold also echoes march movements from Beethoven's third and fifth. The fifth movement, for all its deliciously macabre tone painting, is essentially a rondo, or at least it fully evolves into one by the end. That should give you a little bit of background as we go forward, though of course there's so much more to say about it, and I strongly recommend you do some more research of your own. Now, let's look at the instrumentation of Symphonie Fantastique. The first thing to consider in works of this period is how orchestral instrumentation was going through a very fertile period of innovation and expansion. New materials, keywork, and proportions were all being explored by instrument builders, which would eventually lead to today's standard forms. For instance, Berlioz uses natural horns and natural trumpets, and yet also employs two cornets with pistons, an innovation that wouldn't become standard for horns and trumpets for a few more decades. The cornets, being fully chromatic, can bridge between the harmonic series pitches of its natural brass cousins, giving Berlioz far more freedom to modulate when he needs to. The next thing to think about is how Berlioz features certain instruments as guest soloists in highly dramatic ways. Just as that visiting Shakespearean company might highlight a certain overdramatic actress, Berlioz doesn't just throw a brief solo to the English horn player or the clarinetist playing the little E-flat. He lavishes their part with generously expressive and expansive soliloquies, edge-of-the-seat tension, and even blatant ribaldry. This in turn helped these rarer symphonic instruments of that day to become more common, dependable resources for generations of orchestrators and composers to follow. Despite all this, what's remarkable about the Symphonie Fantastique is how playable it is and how well it balances on modern instruments, with far less adjustment needed than other works of the same period. While there are some standout period instrument recordings, even using some instrument choices that Berlioz ultimately abandoned, there's not as pressing a need to implement exhaustive period practice when interpreting this work, as it pulls the orchestra forward every bit as much as later Beethoven sonatas anticipated the fuller, richer pianos of today. Another principle that Berlioz laid down was the concept of using subsets of available orchestral players into specifically designed orchestras producing different landscapes of color and scope. Of course, Beethoven and others had already done something similar, especially in adding heavy brass and percussion to the end of a symphony. Berlioz took things further, though, by designing a separate soundscape for each and every movement, so much so that it's really better to introduce those soundscapes one at a time to get to know the instruments he used, and why. So let's start with the first movement, Reveries, Passions, our programmatic sonata allegro. A quick glance seems to reveal a fairly standard small orchestra, but let's dig a little deeper. 2 flutes, the second doubling piccolo, which is used toward the end of the movement as much for color as for pitch. 2 oboes. Notice how often Berlioz uses the first oboe in a solo or featured line to express the outlook of the lovelorn artist. 2 B-flat clarinets. 4 bassoons, sometimes in a massive unison line, at others 2 on a voice in intervals. French orchestras commonly had 4 bassoons in the Romantic era, a tendency you can see all the way up to the end of the century. It makes for a very solid base to the wind section. Next, the brass and percussion, with the aforementioned natural horns and trumpets, plus cornets with pistons in G, and timpani. Notice the transpositions of the natural instruments. The C horns transpose down an octave similar to a bass oboe or bass flute, while the E-flat horns sound down a major sixth. It may seem odd for the lead horns to be pitched in E-flat, but combinations with the C horns and trumpets allow for many harmonies needed throughout the course of modulating to G major and then back to C. Finally, it's worth mentioning the strings, which also have specific minimum numbers assigned to each group: 15 firsts, 15 seconds, 10 violas, 10 cellos, and 9 basses. I'm just going to jump in here and say that, once again, it's not normally necessary for a modern concert orchestrator to indicate string numbers when working with a professional orchestra. But, in Berlioz's day, string sections were often woefully understaffed. Mozart wrote to his father about the excitement he felt to hear one of his pieces performed by as many as 40 string players, which today we might consider to be a smaller string section. In Berlioz's case, his numbers are not too far off compared to some pro-orchestra numbers. A couple of edits increasing the size of the firsts and violas bring the string numbers more up to date. There isn't any change indicated in string numbers throughout the symphony, but it's worth remembering that this fully stocked section might have been even more a factor in intensifying the overall impression of grandeur on the audience than the brass and percussion in later movements. For his waltz movement, titled Un Bal, Berlioz loses the bassoons, the trumpets, the cornets, and the timpani. Just a single oboe this time instead of a pair, maintaining Berlioz's point-of-view solo voice throughout. Second flute again will play piccolo in certain passages, while clarinets are pitched in A to match the key of the movement. Notice that horns aren't pitched in A, but in E and C. This is easily explained by the E horns actually giving more scope to harmonies that move away from the tonic, while the C horns provide rich lower natural E's as dominant pitches, which are the bulk of what they play throughout the movement, with a few exceptions. There's a peculiar feature of this movement in that Berlioz initially composed an obligato cornet part that weaves its way through the music, sometimes beefing up melodic lines, and at other times just adding a little textural or rhythmic support. Though he deleted the part in his final version for publications, many orchestras put it back in. It doesn't make an enormous difference one way or another, but presents yet another tantalizing footnote in studying this work. The notable guest players here are 4 harps playing in doubled pairs, which appear nowhere else in the other 4 movements. They convey the ultimate sense of sophisticated but light-hearted celebration, gushing luxuriously with little difficulty at balancing with the reduced orchestra. Notice the harmonic simplicity, mostly between sharp pitches and natural pitches. Though the modern double-action harp had been invented 20 years before, Berlioz scores nothing that couldn't be played easily on single-action harps, with a few enharmonic substitutions covering the occasional flat. People often remark on the fifth movement's Ophicleides and bells as possibly having made this piece more difficult to program for orchestras back then. But the truth is that this movement with its quadruple harps presented the greatest challenge in hiring players back in the 1830s. It was wise of Berlioz to hedge his bets and not count on any specific model of harp. The third movement drops the harps and restores the quartet of bassoons. Most significantly, though, is the featured doubling of second oboe on English horn, playing a shepherd's pipe solo, then echoed an octave higher by offstage first oboe. This is the first big English horn appearance in any symphony in the standard repertoire, and thank goodness for that because it's stuck, and thus this rich resource of timbre and melodicity is now standard. The English horn was actually developed right alongside the oboe back in the Baroque period. But the classical era mostly passed it by. Here Berlioz shows how wrong it was to ignore it for all those years. Though the key is nominally in F major, Berlioz wants more freedom of harmonic motion for his horns, with clearer pitches that aren't stopped in order to sneak in a pitch outside the spectrum. This results in scoring of first and second horns in F, third horn in E flat, and fourth in C. Not only are a panoply of different harmonies now possible, but the fourth can also double certain melodic gestures in the dominant key of C. Berlioz asks for 4 timpanists covering 1 kettle each, adding a note that the second timpanist should take over 2 kettles in the finale, and the third and fourth timpanist can move to bass drum. Timpani appear purely as a dramatic injection here, as distant thunder rumbling behind the return of the English horn solo at the end of the movement. Berlioz uses rolled intervals and clustering of pitches to achieve a harmonically ambiguous effect, rather than underlining any specific pitch. This too was groundbreaking. With Movement 4, Berlioz suddenly expands the scope of the orchestra to a fuller, more functional percussion section, not to mention adding heavy brass. Starting from the top of the page, though, the winds become a little more conservative than previous movements, with no added piccolo, no more English horn, and our standard bevy of 4 bassoons. But interestingly, in this movement of 2 flats, Berlioz chooses C clarinets rather than their more convenient B-flat cousins. And that just brings up a further issue. If you've been paying attention to the overall harmonic scheme of this symphony, you'll notice that it doesn't necessarily follow any traditional scheme of key relationships. The previous adagio was in F, which is a traditional key contrast in a C major symphony, but the second movement was in the unrelated key of A, and now the fourth movement is in G minor and B flat. But why? And why is Berlioz so deliberately flouting common practice approaches up to this point? The answer is that he's largely picking keys that make his musical ideas sound good on the instrumentation he's chosen. What's more, he'll also pick the instrument that sounds best for the effect that's needed. This is why in the C major first movement he scores clarinet parts on the larger, richer B-flat model, and in the G minor/B-flat major fourth movement he picks the shallower, brighter C clarinets. But that still leaves the question of why B-flat in the first place? And the answer lies in the ability of the tenor trombone to play its fundamental B-flat in first position. Berlioz wants that guttural note to drone raucously below the music, and even step down there to a pedal A. He couldn't get that effect in A minor/C major, that's for sure, not with the standard trombone of 1830. So it's quite easy to bring the tuning of most of the other brass into line with this. B-flat trumpets, B-flat cornets, and even first and second horns, with the third and fourth horns in the complementary key of E-flat. You may be wondering why Berlioz has chosen to score the upper pair of horns with a lower crook, the B-flat basso, sounding down a major ninth below written pitches instead of down a major sixth like the E-flat horns. The reason is that he wants his most capable players involved in the big brass chorale playing an octave below the harmonized melody in the trumpets and cornets. As to the so-called tuba parts, these were originally intended to be played on Ophicleide. This was an odd hybrid instrument with a brass body and brass instrument mouthpiece, and yet with tone holes, using a standard woodwind configuration a little like a saxophone. Before the modern tuba was invented, the Ophicleide was used to provide a solid base to the brass section, yet another feature of early Romantic era instrumentation. The far more agile and easy-to-control tuba quickly replaced it, to the extent that scores and parts of this work and others are simply marked tuba from the late 19th century onward, and there's little indication that Berlioz would have any problem with this substitution. In fact, in his grand treatise he's quite disparaging of the Ophicleide. All the same, period recordings and performances usually feature an Ophicleide specialist, and the parts fit the instrument very well. Berlioz keeps 3 of his timpanists around for this movement, along with the addition of snare drum, cymbal pair, and bass drum. A stray marking of senza sword at bar 121 has caused editors to go back to the beginning of the movement and add markings indicating that the timpani should start muted, being drummed with their covers on. Or perhaps Berlioz intended that their entrance at the end of the previous movement should have been where the mute started, since they were conveying the effect of distant thunder rumbling? Whatever the answer, muted or not, the timpani are relentless. You'll notice a certain growing audacity and sense of outrageous demands on the orchestra of the 1830s. Berlioz's sense of confidence in his own genius, along with his undeniable mastery of craft, gave him the courage to score the game-changing finale. And what a sight it is on the page, looking so much like an early 20th century work like Firebird or Daphnis and Chloe, with its multiple divisi strings and massive brass and percussion sections. But let's start at the top one last time and work our way down. First flute and dedicated piccolo part throughout, our trusty 2 oboes and 4 bassoons as usual, and this time E-flat and C clarinet. Once again, Berlioz is breaking new ground by bringing in an unusual auxiliary into the orchestral ranks. The E-flat clarinet's piping, thin sound is the perfect vehicle to portray the transformation of the idée fixe into a taunting, sadistic mockery of its original poetry. Berlioz now reflips the positions of his horns, dropping the C basso horns back to the 3rd and 4th player, and moving the E-flat horns back to the 1st and 2nd. Trumpets in E-flat will sound up a minor third from their written pitches, but never get higher than a written E sounding G above the staff. B-flat cornets are back again, as are a trio of trombones. Also back are our Ophicleides. But once again, there's an anecdote worth mentioning here. Just like the cornet obbligato back in Movement 2, Berlioz originally conceived of a part that he later abandoned. In this case, it was to score one of the Ophicleide parts on the Serpent, an odd-looking fingered wooden instrument played with a brass-type mouthpiece. Apparently, Berlioz's experience with this instrument at the premiere was not at all to his liking, to judge from his rather comical appraisal in the Grand Treatise. Nevertheless, some period performances do restore the Serpent to its sepulchral place, where it brays chillingly in the Dies Irae. As to percussion, our 2 timpanists positioned on opposite sides of the stage are back again, and as promised, the other timpanists play the bass drum mounted upright like a giant kettle drum. Berlioz also introduced bells into the orchestra, but as yet no standard approach existed to supply the sound. All kinds of substitutes were devised, from offstage pianos to large strings tightened over sound boxes and beaten with mallets, all the way to purpose-built bells similar to ship's bells. Standard tubular bells can also work, but many conductors feel that they lack the necessary oomph. The premiere of Symphonie Fantastique captured the imagination of the listeners, and was considered to be a terrific success. not to mention a stunning debut for Berlioz himself as a composer. Most importantly, though, his biggest supporters were the musicians in the orchestra, and that enthusiasm and momentum would prove essential for the success of the work. And yet Berlioz wasn't satisfied, and over the next couple years he revised and perfected Symphonie Fantastique into the version we know today, and it was again presented to the public in 1832, along with its sequel, Lélio. This time Harriet Smithson was in the audience, and as she absorbed this enormous musical homage to her, it dawned on her that the crazy young man who'd written her countless letters that she never answered just might be a genius after all. Eventually they would meet and get married, and though that marriage was not a success in the end, there was no question that the passion Smithson kindled in Berlioz changed the entire concept of what a symphony could be. Before, even at its height with Beethoven, the symphony had merely been a formal work, in which a community of musicians worked through musical themes and developments together. After Berlioz, a symphony could be a tone poem, a dramatic program, and even a kind of musical novel. In the hands of a capable conductor, it could also become a kind of apotheosis of art, an ultimate exploration of the possibilities of human intellect, emotion, and imagination. We've been very lucky in recent lectures to have the cooperation of some excellent orchestras in sharing their music. Just as I was starting to release this series, the orchestra of the University of Music, FRANZ LISZT Weimar, did us the honor of granting permission to excerpt their 2016 performance of Symphonie Fantastique. This orchestra of future professionals from one of Europe's finest conservatories delivers a polished, passionate reading of the work, with a freshness that really brings Berlioz's youthful masterpiece to life. Their conductor, Nicolás Pasquet, is world-class, with that rare gift of building every passage and phrase with finesse and real soul into a towering interpretation. It means all that much more to share this kind of accomplishment of young musicians reaching their artistic potential with my audience of developing orchestrators. I've linked the full performance for you to watch in the information, with huge thanks to Maestro Pasquet and the staff and musicians of the university. I know this is kind of a huge video by now, but all in all, it's still just a very small attempt to describe what's going on just for the instrumentation of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, not to mention anything about the orchestration. For that, I'll see you in our first in-depth lecture covering the first part of the first movement of this symphony, coming very soon.